with a lot of life before me, and a moment came that stopped me on a dime.
Right.
I spent
Kind of nervous to be the first one on the stage, but I'm okay. Hey, listen, I was hoping you all could do me a huge favor. Over the summer, I embarked on a 2,600-mile journey from the tiny town of Drake, Massachusetts, up in New England, all the way down to Apache Junction, Arizona, where I spent some time exploring the Superstition Mountains. Now, because I traveled by myself, I missed out on all those campfire stories that people tell right before they fall asleep at night. So my question is, would you be willing to join me by my campfire to hear my story? But before you answer, just know that my story's scary. Not because of ghosts or goblins or Bigfoot-like creatures who scratch at your tent at night, but rather that you might see a little bit of you in it. So what do you say? Are you in?
Yeah!
Awesome, awesome. Now, my story doesn't start on a dark and stormy night as you'd expect, but rather on a cold day earlier this year. On Tuesday, February 7th at 5 p.m., I did something I never thought I would have the courage to do. I pressed the Go Live button on my computer and started my own podcast. Now, what's my podcast about? Well, I call it ARTalk. It's a 30-minute video program that I broadcast every Tuesday night live on both Facebook and YouTube. And over the course of the last 8 months, I've had the privilege to interview all sorts of amazing people, from painters to writers, food artists to pumpkin carvers. Anna? Each conversation's been unique, and each has offered insight into the creative process. Now, this idea about starting a podcast about art actually came to me several years ago when I noticed that many of the people I knew seemed to have an interest in pursuing their creativity, yet very few were acting on it. And when I asked, the most common response was, "I'm not talented enough," which coincidentally was exactly why it took me several years to do my podcast to begin with. But the truth is, we all have a creative side and we all have talent. What I think prevents us from exploring it or sharing it with others is this monster that lurks just beyond the glow of our campfire here. We don't know what it is or what it can do to us, but we are terrified. So what do? Well, we snuggle deep into our sleeping bags where it's warm and it's safe, and we tell ourselves that we can't, we don't know how, or it's just too hard. And this is the language of fear. And we use it to keep from changing because, well, it's better to be safe than eaten, right? But is it? You see, the problem with hiding in our sleeping bags is that it restricts growth. Yes, they're comfy and cozy, but they don't do anything to afford us the freedom that we need to live our lives on our own terms. And I wanted to change that. So I designed my podcast to chase those monsters away. By creating this safe environment where two people can simply have a conversation, I'm able to highlight and explore their creativity while also giving them a voice to be heard. And what I really found cool was how people acted once they stepped outside of their sleeping bags, their comfort zones. They find that it's never this fanged monster of their imagination, but rather their own minds working against them. And you know, there's a certain magic that happens when people discover how truly brave they are. So I'm very thankful that my podcast has been able to excite and motivate and inspire others to be that brave. It's actually been quite remarkable. But I will be honest, I have my own monsters that lurk outside of this campfire. And to me, they're so big and so scary that they often make me doubt everything I want to do. And the funny thing is, they're all based on stories I've told myself over the years, so much so that I feel like I've almost become addicted to them. Take my father, for example. Now, my dad was not what I would call an amicable fellow. As a child, I remember how gruff he was and how quick he was to anger, especially towards me. And he didn't really show me affection, which was confusing because other fathers seemed to have really good relationships with their sons. Now, as the years went by and I grew older, our relationship grew more and more tenuous until finally, during my senior year of high school, I felt so alienated that I nearly got into a fist fight with him. You know, if it wasn't for a friend of mine who happened to be with us at the time, I really hate to think about how that day could have ended. But here's the thing. My father was not the monster that I feared. What really scared me was my own imagination. You see, I was so afraid to know why he felt and acted the way that he did that I never asked him. Now, had I would have discovered that his behaviors were the result of his own fears brought on by an incredibly difficult life. You see, my father was born in 1919. He was the son of a low-income truck driver and a German immigrant housewife, and of their 6 children, my dad was the only one to survive the Great Flu epidemic, which wiped out more than 21 million people worldwide. And as a teen, he grew up during the Great Depression, finding himself in and out of correctional facilities, shoplifting, burglarizing, just to survive. And then later, as a World War II airman, he saw combat over Asia as a tail gunner. Now, can you imagine for a moment what it was like for him to kill other people while hoping he himself wasn't killed? I mean, I can't. And you know I never will, because he passed away in 1987, well before I knew any of this. You see, the story that I had created was that he didn't love me. Put another way, I was predicting, or had predicted, that his truth would be far more painful to me than this fantasy that I created. So it was easy for me to stay snuggled in my sleeping bag than it was to find the courage, talk to him, and actually learn the truth. Now, this idea about predicting negative outcomes, for me specifically, explains why I've always tended towards the path of least resistance, looking for opportunities that were safe and well established. Because you see, to do something different, something unexpected, well, it came with these monsters of judgment, criticism, and heaven forbid, exposure. Do you know how many times I used to say to myself, if people only knew the real me, I'd spend my entire life alone? So in a very weird sort of way, it was probably good that I found the military. I joined the Coast Guard in 1984 when I was 19 years old. And although I often tell people that my motivation for joining was financial, that's really not true. The truth is I needed to escape. Because see, I was running from this tumultuous relationship with my father, running from all these issues I had created with my friends. Heck, I was running from all these stories that I had created that seemed to leave me in this perpetual state of fear. And you want to know something? It worked perfectly. For more than 35 years, I was able to stay those monsters, playing a very specific role as an American service member. And I was groomed for it. From my very first day of service, I was told that my purpose was to serve the greater good, that my individuality, or those traits that make up who I am, were far less valued than those services that I provided. So for me, it was really easy to adopt the Coast Guard's motto of semper paratus, or always ready, because I was often recognized and rewarded for my stellar work efforts, but never once for the type of person that I was. But living my entire life in this military sleeping bag came with a substantial cost. Over time, I forgot how to be spontaneous. I forgot how to feel my emotions. And I forgot how to make decisions for myself. And the result of all this was 2 failed marriages, no stable home, and not a single lasting friendship. And I was okay with that until one day I found myself cast out into the darkness. In 2020, after more than 3 decades of service, I was told that I had to retire. I was outcompeted for the next pay grade. Being so ill-equipped to handle all those monsters that I had avoided for so long, I once again took the path of least resistance. I consumed my wife's life. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, her life was well established. It had a routine. It was a well-known quantity. So I immediately took over all the chores, started paying all the bills, started keeping the house organized, starting to clean everything, all the while throwing her life into complete and utter chaos. And although it was unintentional, it created this unnecessary conflict that we're still trying to resolve to this day. Now, the turning point for me, though, came one cold New England morning, when I was doing, of all things, laundry. I don't know whether or not it was because of this rogue sock that I was chasing or because my fingertips were so cold, but out of the blue, I asked myself, is this the life you want to live? Absolutely, it was not. I mean, deep down inside, I felt as if I was destined to live this amazing life, and yet here I was, chasing this stupid sock. Something radical needed to happen. Now pull a little closer, folks, because this is where my story gets really scary. In that moment of clarity, I knew that in order for me to live this amazing life that I wanted, I had to change my mind about who I thought I was. But in order to do that, I had to be willing to release or to let go of all those stories that left me in fear. But how? How was I going to do this? Well, coaching was essential because without it, I never would have known that I had been telling myself lies. You see, I firmly believe that my history, my experiences and my perceptions about them was the absolute truth. And you can see why I would believe this, right? Because it was me who had the experiences, it was me who felt the feelings, it was me who put two and two together to reach my own conclusions. But the problem is, history is not objective. Winston Churchill, that famous statesman, he knew this. He once famously said, "History is written by the victors." And what he implies is that history is not grounded in fact, but rather the winner's interpretation. It follows then that if history is indeed subjective, then I could change my own by simply pivoting the way I thought about myself. In other words, I had the power to change my stories to whatever I needed them to be to begin to release some of that languishing fear. And while I did that, I also took a deep dive into all the scary things I've done in my life, and I realized I'd actually done quite a few. And when I did this, I came to realize two things. First, my fears were never about the outcome, but rather the journey. Now, I know that's kind of hard to believe, but overwhelmingly, I wanted the outcome. I desired the outcome. I was passionate about the outcome. What really scared me was, how was I going to get there? And the second thing I realized was that I'm actually a very curious person. I began to wonder, what prompted me to do these things to begin with, and how did I even manage to do them at all? Was there a formula? And more importantly, was there a formula that I could leverage with intention to help combat my fears? Well, interestingly, there was. I found that I repeated 5 things, 5 steps, time and time again, without even knowing I was doing them. First, when I thought about this thing that scared me, like starting a podcast or driving by myself across country, I also felt an underlying excitement. It was as if, despite that fear, just thinking about this thing made me feel good. Now, today I see it as the universe offering me an opportunity to grow, an inspired action to take. So the first step was to take notice. Still, excitement alone does nothing to quell the fear. So I didn't. Step 2 was simply to acknowledge it. You see, the fear I felt around all these scary things was legitimate, but only because I was experiencing it. Like I said, I've got a history. I'm exposed to social media and the news. I was influenced by my family, my friends, and my peers. The thoughts and the fears that I had wasn't simply going to go away because I wanted them to. Fear, I came to realize, was just resistance. Now, today, when fear creeps in, as it did this morning, I still don't resist it, but I do self-regulate. I might breathe. I might use the emotional freedom technique or tapping, or I might use some of the other tools at my disposal, like trying to identify what thoughts hide behind the feelings I'm having. The third step was to ask myself an antithetical question. What do I mean? Well, instead of always asking myself, well, geez, John, what if you fail? I would ask, well, what if I won? And do you know that when I did this, my brain had no choice but to pause to answer the question. And when it did, I felt even better about the thing. The fourth step was to decide. Now, for me, to decide took the most courage because to decide is powerful. To decide is to take control of your own life. Me deciding to join the Coast Guard was just as powerful as me deciding to start a podcast. And without deciding, I would have missed out on all those amazing opportunities. Now, the fifth and final step was for me probably the most critical, because without it, I don't think I would be here today speaking to you. In each scary moment of my life, I took an action, even if it was small, to bring me one step closer to this thing that excited me. I saw it in 1984 Buffalo when I spent a dime for a bus ride to go to the recruiting office. I saw it earlier this year when I browsed Amazon to buy a microphone for my future podcast. And I saw it when I said yes to Allison Roberts and Behind the Power this year, almost a year ago, well before I had any idea of what I was going to speak about today. Each little action I took brought me one step closer to this thing, but more importantly, it gave me both the evidence and the confidence I needed to actually do the thing. Now, being this curious person that I am, I can't help but wonder, what would it be like for you if you were to step outside of your sleeping bag and listen to your inspirations? What if you recognized fear for what it really is, resistance? What if you thought more about winning and a little less about losing and finally made that decision? And what if you were to take one small action to move you one step closer to the lives I know you deserve? Now, if anything, this is stuff to think about, right? Time is winding down, but before we go our separate ways this morning, I would like to throw one last log on my campfire here to tie up one final loose end. When my father passed away in 1987, I was afraid that I had lost any possibility of reconciliation. But again, that was just a story that I told myself because I was too afraid to face the pain. And it really wasn't until I began to reconstruct his life and really dig into the man that I learned so much about him. And what I found was a man who did love, but who also made mistakes. And within me, I found compassion and a lot of him and me. The only difference between the two of us, I believe, is that I now have the awareness and the tools to help combat those monsters. He didn't. And my healing finally came when I acknowledged and recognized his value as a person who had both his strengths and his weaknesses, but was only doing the best he could. He might have been my father, but I think we all can agree that he was a human, and us human beings, well, we're far from perfect. So to forgive him was easy, and to forgive myself the same. And forgiveness, my friends, is nothing to be afraid of. Now, if you'd like to talk more about fear, or if you want to talk about art, I happen to know a podcast that would love to have you. Sweet dreams, and thank you very much.